Greetings to our audience tuning in from around the world. I'm Barry Pavel. I'm a Senior Vice President at the Atlantic Council and Director of the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. I'd like to welcome you to today's timely discussion on countering Chinese disinformation, a topic that is growing in importance and underappreciated. And this is co-hosted by the Scowcroft Center's Asia Security Initiative, the Digital Forensics Research Lab at the Atlantic Council also, and our good friends at the International Republican Institute. As many of you know, with the onset of COVID-19, Chinese efforts to shape a global narrative through a combination of very assertive diplomacy as well as misinformation and disinformation have intensified greatly, not just in the Indo-Pacific, but really around the world. Chinese officials spread false information in the early days of the pandemic, interfered in democratic elections in places like Taiwan, and have targeted international perceptions of pro-democracy demonstrations in Hong Kong, human rights abuses in Xinjiang, and in a lot of other domains and on other topics. Understanding the changing nature of Chinese efforts to exert influence online and offline around the world is a major challenge. And we're very fortunate today to be joined by really top experts to help us better understand these developments. What do they mean for the United States and for US allies and partners? All of today's panelists have published recent reports on Chinese information operations. So I'm excited to hear their diverse perspectives on the greatest challenges and opportunities we face in the years ahead on this issue set. This event is part of the Scowcroft Center's growing body of work focused on helping advance US and allies' efforts to respond effectively to China's rise more broadly and to defend a rules-based international system. Our efforts on China are a key piece of our center's broader mission of honoring the late General Brent Scowcroft's legacy of service and embodying his ethos of nonpartisan commitment to the cause of security and support for US leadership in close cooperation with US allies and partners, and dedication to the mentorship of the next generation of leaders. We're delighted to have partnered on these efforts with our colleagues at the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensics Research Lab, which operationalizes the study of disinformation by exposing falsehoods in the media, documenting human rights abuses, building digital resilience worldwide, and much, much more. Our joint work under this project centered on China's propaganda strategy of what's called discourse power, which is the concept that a country can attain increased geopolitical power by setting agendas internationally through influencing the political order and values both domestically and internationally. The first report of the series sought to understand and explain China's logic and tactics in trying to tell a China story, as well as its underlying geopolitical goals. The remaining reports assessed specific cases. First, the application of Chinese discourse power in Taiwan's 2020 presidential election. Second, Hong Kong's 2019 anti-extradition bill movement. And third, the Chinese diaspora community. Our final report by Senior Fellow Dexter Roberts draws on DFR Lab's research to assess the broader dimensions and policy implications and the future of Chinese disinformation. We are very thankful to the Taipei Economic and Cultural Representative Office, TECRO, for our vibrant partnership with them on this work and much more over many years. And of course, it's a real honor to be working again with our friends at IRI, which continues to be a global leader in efforts to promote digital democracy worldwide. In particular, I commend their latest report, Detecting Digital Fingerprints, Tracing Chinese Disinformation in Taiwan, which will be a key part of today's discussion. Before we get started, I'd like to remind everyone that today's event is open to the public and on the record. Please do feel free to send us your questions on Twitter using the hashtag ACAsia or through the Q&A function on Zoom. And with that, I'll hand the virtual mic over to Dr. Daniel Twining, who is the president of the International Republican Institute, for his opening remarks. Dr. Twining, please.
Thank you, Barry. It's such a pleasure to be here with you and so many distinguished colleagues from both Atlantic Council and IRI. I should say that General Scowcroft was on our board of directors for many years at IRI, and as a young staff guy working for then Chairman Senator McCain, I learned so much from him in IRI board meetings and beyond. So that's another cool element of connectivity between our organizations. Really, we're delighted to be holding this event on countering Chinese disinformation with all of you at the Atlantic Council. You've been pioneers in helping to think through these issues. The Chinese Communist Party's malign efforts at manipulating the information space abroad, as you all know, have expanded dramatically and very aggressively over the past 5 years. COVID and the pandemic has brought them into a new light, and I think helped focus a lot of attention on the way that the CCP has weaponized information around the pandemic in the digital domain. I don't think I need to go into great length, but I think we'll hear more about how China's expanding influence operations undermine democratic processes. They reduce political leaders' accountability to their own citizens. They put at risk US strategic interests, the sovereignty of many nations where they operate, and they really undercut common efforts to champion good governance, promote transparency, and build resilience to these forms of malign influence. The opacity, complexity, and rapidly evolving nature of CCP information operations mean that journalists, civil society groups, technologists, cultural figures, and ultimately citizens and policymakers need the support of programs like those featured on this panel today. At IRI, we address this challenge through our digital democracy programming led by my brilliant colleague, Amy Studdart, who you're about to hear a little more from. We also engage on these issues through our work on countering malign foreign influence around the world, really now expanding into every region because this is a global issue, and really in so many of the country programs that we implement, including far beyond Asia. Ultimately, the answer to digital authoritarianism is to invest in and support small d Democrats who want to sustain a free and open information space, want to protect the integrity of their civil society, of their democratic institutions, of their sovereign rights to speak for themselves and not have malign third-party actors come in and subvert or co-opt or corrupt democratic discourse in their countries. Democracy cannot work if a foreign hand is manipulating information, running very sophisticated disinformation operations in countries that really has the effect of separating citizens from those who lead them. So we all have a common interest in breaking this link and helping countries build resiliency, including through civic education, including through new technology tools, and fundamentally through political leadership. So I'm delighted to be with you all. I will hand it over to Ms. Jessica Drun to moderate the event and introduce the panel. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jessica Drun, and I'm a non-resident fellow with the Project 2049 Institute, and I'm happy and honored to be here to discuss a timely and important topic of countering Chinese disinformation. I'd like to begin by introducing the panel, each of whom have recently published hard-hitting reports on countering Chinese dis and misinformation. First, we have Mr. Dexter Tiff Roberts, non-resident senior fellow with the Asia Security Initiative at the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security here at the Atlantic Council. Next, we have Ms. Amy Studdart, Senior Advisor for Digital Democracy with the Center for Global Impact at the International Republican Institute. Next, joining us from Taipei, we have Dr. Puma Shen, Assistant Professor at National Taipei University and Director of Doublethink Lab. And finally, we have Mr. Emerson T. Brooking, Resident Fellow with the Digital Forensic Research Lab here at the Atlantic Council. Before I turn it over to the panelists, I want to go over a few logistics in the panel format. We've asked the panelists to each present a few minutes on the key takeaways from each of their recent works on Chinese disinformation. After all four present, I will open the floor for discussion. Also, a friendly reminder to the audience that you can submit your questions for the Q&A at any time using the Q&A function on Zoom. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dexter.
Thank you, Jessica. I'd like today to start by going over some of the broad defining features of China's propaganda and disinformation strategy. And the overarching focus is on the message that China is on a trajectory to become a modern, unified, and globally powerful country. And the accompanying message is that the US is moving the opposite direction or declining. Disinformation and both propaganda are focused heavily on the issue of sovereignty and ensuring that China both protects and reinforces what it defines as its territorial integrity. Therefore, the arenas where China's propaganda and disinformation has been most active, not surprisingly, are Hong Kong, which all of us know has been facing a protest movement that is pushing back against Beijing's encroachments on Hong Kong, and Taiwan, which China ultimately, of course, wants to take full control over, and sees its independence today as an aberration of history, which it intends to end. Another very important factor is the fact that the propaganda and disinformation push is very much tied to the continuing rise of one of the most powerful leaders China has seen in many, many years. And that, of course, is President and Party Secretary Xi Jinping. Xi has abandoned the doctrine that was established by former paramount leader Deng Xiaoping, which argued that China should, in effect, keep its head low and bide its time as it became more powerful. Today, Xi Jinping very much has set that aside for a far more muscular and assertive presence overseas for China. We also know now that Xi Jinping intends to be in power for many, many years to come. He has also made it clear that China has some important goals ahead, including becoming a prosperous, modern country, a global superpower with a military commensurate with its strength. At the same time that China uses its propaganda and disinformation overseas, there is another equally important audience much closer to home, and that is the Chinese people that are the citizens of the People's Republic of China. It is essential for the Chinese Communist Party to convince the Chinese people at home that, again, China is on a course to become an increasingly modern, unified, and globally powerful country. That desire to push that discourse at home is very much driven by the reality that China is facing some very substantial challenges, economic challenges at home. Because of some key constraints for its growth, including particularly growing debt, demographic trends which go against it with an aging population and a shrinking workforce, and the fact that there are some unfinished reforms that the leadership has made very little progress on, we can assume that China will face a much slower growth in the coming years than it has experienced over the previous decades. So the propaganda and the disinformation and misinformation also aims to convince the Chinese population that indeed China will overcome these obstacles and become a global superpower. It also aims to emphasize and exaggerate any signs of US decline. Finally, another key audience, we argue in our reports, is the Chinese diaspora, and particularly in places like the United States. And here, again, the purpose is to emphasize the continued rise of China and emphasize or exaggerate any decline in the United States. The ultimate goal is to convince some of the best and the brightest from China's diaspora to decide to return back to China to live their lives and establish their careers. China, because of these economic challenges, has embarked on a very a real turn in its economic strategy going forward. It aims to become far more self-reliant, much more dependent on the spending power of its own people, and of course wants to establish its own very powerful indigenous Chinese technology. Getting more of the best and the brightest Chinese diaspora to return is key to that. I'll stop here and hand it back to you, Jessica.
Thank you, Dexter. Amy, you're up next.
Wonderful. Thank you so much to the Atlantic Council for the partnership on this event, first and foremost. I also want to say that the report that was linked in the invitation, and you can search online, was really a partnership between so many different actors. First and foremost, I want to highlight my research co-authors, IFTF's Digital Intelligence Lab and Graphica. It was also a real partnership between the Taiwanese government and the State Department, the US State Department. We received so much support from all of them. But really, the sort of critical actor in us being able to do that report was Taiwanese civil society. And I'm so glad that we have Puma here from Doublethink Labs, who can talk a little bit about what they've been doing at the grassroots. And I also want to highlight this incredible project that we worked on with NDI as well, run by GovZero, called the Zero Archive Project, where over the course of many, many months, Zero Archive went through and genuinely just archived both the content and the metadata of a lot of what we were seeing in the online information space. I will end with another point on Taiwanese civil society, but I could spend the whole time talking about how brilliant a partner they had been to us. In writing our report, it was a real privilege and not something that you often see in the information space and information space research, to spend literally a whole year looking at just Taiwan and Chinese language disinformation and misinformation in the Taiwanese ecosystem. Often, I think what we end up doing, usually due to resource constraints, is looking at a flashpoint, a single election. You look at the month before the election, and then you're not able to follow up after. And so you don't really get to do this sort of whole ecosystem approach. And we wouldn't have been able to do that without all of that great partnership. What we did was, just a quick note on methodology, what we did was, over the course of a year, spend a lot of time in Taiwan interviewing the government, interviewing civil society, interviewing members of not all of the political parties, but because by the time the election came around, there were a whole bunch of political parties, but we certainly interviewed 5 different political parties over the course of that period, and then went out and watched the election. In addition to all of the incredible digital forensics work that was really led by Graphica and IFTF, where we were watching Network Max play out online during the course of that year. It was a very interesting year, and I think that this, what happened over the course of that period, says a lot about China's strategic objectives and how China evolves and adapts when it comes to information manipulation. When my colleague Joe Gao and I headed to Taiwan for the first time to commence this project in June of 2019, the assumption was that the incumbent party, the DPP, would lose, because the disinformation about the DPP was so prolific. The support online for the opposition was so high, who were much more in favor of the status quo vis-a-vis China, was so high, and the outcome of the 2018 local elections had been so shaped by what seemed to be just a radical shift in what the information space looked like, that we really just thought that it was predetermined that, she would probably lose, the DPP would probably lose, and that this information operation was likely to be the thing that swung it. That really evolved. So around the time that we were there, the Hong Kong protests were starting to kick off, which really changed sentiment about China within Taiwan for obvious reasons. And this idea that Beijing could be an accommodating partner really started to be undermined by the actions that took place in Hong Kong. That then continued over the course of the next 6 months in the lead up to the election. When the election happened, by that point, it wasn't a tenable position for any political party to have strategic policies, objectives that aligned with Beijing's interests, because events had made that really not politically salient in the Taiwanese context. And so the strategy had shifted. What we were seeing in the information space had really changed by the time we got to January, which is when the election happened. There was a lot less sort of support for not pro-China candidates, but pro-status quo candidates, and a lot more openness in the online space around support for folks who were willing to take a harder line on Beijing. So the night before the election, a piece of misinformation started to circulate that there was a virus that had come from China and was likely to infect people at polling stations. And that was the first time, I think, certainly on our side, others might have seen that kind of information starting to circulate. But this attempt at essentially voter suppression was the first time that we saw the COVID disinformation start to play out. That then continued after. So we continue to look at the sort of post-election environment up until June of this year as well. What that ended up looking like was an effort essentially to discredit the election itself. So there were, as we see in a lot of different contexts, rather than the goal necessarily being about changing the outcome of the election in a way that might aid a foreign power's strategic objectives. Instead, the objective became discrediting the election and the democratic process in and of itself, and then discrediting the outcome of the election. And so we did start to see a lot more stuff like, voter suppression, or this will be familiar to folks who watch the US election. The CIA, the one disinformation narrative was that the CIA had supplied a secret ink for some of the ballots that meant that if you voted for certain candidates, then your vote would disappear. And so we started to see that kind of thing happening. And then in the aftermath of the election, we started to see the discrediting of the DPP and the outcome of the election, particularly as it related to COVID, but much more broadly as well. So that's sort of how the narrative changed and shifted. I'll talk a little bit as well about the disinformation ecosystem. So one thing that is really evident, that became very evident to us, is that online disinformation, particularly, maybe not particularly in Taiwan, but as it relates to Chinese disinformation, is just one element that is then supported by a whole backdrop of other elements that are related to disinformation. So we also saw, the online disinformation.
Hey, Amy,
Yeah.
I'm really sorry to have to cut you off, but I'm sure this will come up again in the question and answer session, but just for the sake of time, let's move on to Puma. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. So thanks for the invitation. And since Amy already have a talk about Taiwanese situation here, so I'll talk about several cases we collected here at Doublethink Lab. So everyone recognize Taiwan as uniquely positioned to provide insight into Chinese developing strategies. So but what we do is that we try to archive the Chinese media, Weibo, and WeChat every day in order to look at the high and low of all this online volume for different topics and compare that to the situation in other countries, such as Taiwan, and see whether those trends are connected to Chinese propaganda or the policy document, and further link other attacks around the world. So as a fun fact here, because we're talking about pandemic today, and COVID-19 really swept Wuhan at the very beginning, and it really affects the cyber force because there's actually a cyber force there based in Wuhan. So based on our data, we try to propose a model that brings together the different actors of Chinese information operation. And we found that although some individual agents of Chinese disinformation may appear to have little impacts on our society individually, together their efforts still threaten our democracy by sowing divisions and pushing groups into echo chambers, attacking fundamental democratic values. So during the pandemic, there were countless disseminators of disinformation, so residing in both Greater China and Taiwan. In addition to political-oriented manufacturers and distributors, there were a large number of actors driven by financial interests, say cooperating with others in a decentralization pattern. And where I'm going to introduce like 4 different modes here. And the first one is the propaganda mode. We have been very familiar with that, but the evolution of the propaganda is very sophisticated. So for example, COVID-19 disinformation tinged with Chinese propaganda was shared by Chinese embassies' Facebook fan pages in Romania first, and Slovakia, and simultaneously shared by Myanmar and Vietnam Facebook accounts, and later circulated into Southeast Asia media as well. And on the other hand, Chinese state media, such as Xinhua, Global News, or Reference News, will selectively debunk the disinformation, So in this case, they are using their propaganda as the debunker of the disinformation they create, and that's the first mode we have been specified. And the second one is the trolls and bots mode. It's usually an online operation that involves more netizens, easy to target. It spans from Hong Kong protests to COVID-19 issues, but we cannot rule out the connection between trolls and the CCP government. And these like Little Pink, the netizens can be observed in several communist youth of league groups and certain Weibo and WeChat public accounts. So overseas Chinese in Vietnam, Cambodia, Singapore, Malaysia, Burma, Philippines, they are really influenced by the WeChat official accounts, while their Facebook groups and Twitter accounts are used as the hotbeds for disseminating disinformation. And the third one here I want to mention is the content from articles. So the fabricators, they try to make up this information and even turn that into YouTube videos and knit a piece using sensationalized content from news pieces, disseminating the result through chat apps. That's Line and set up the YouTube channels. And this is the most complicated one since multiple players can be involved. And the intention of dissemination concerning the doctor information from content from websites may be purely commercial, but the likelihood that there are malicious intentions in manipulating public opinion behind the scenes cannot be ruled out either. And the last one I want to mention here is the collaboration mode. It's the local collaborators that kind of work with China, and it's the most demanding challenges and yet to be conquered. It is very difficult to attribute attacks in this mode because China itself is neither the creator nor the distributor of disinformation. So for example, an article involving COVID-19 fake news, it was published in the Malaysia Pro-China newspaper and first distributed in Taiwan by gangsters here in Taiwan that do business in China. And another great example here is that in January, some Chinese public accounts try to spread the information, the disinformation, that compare COVID-19 and the flu. And the importance here are twofold. First, it does not have to be disinformation. It could be any authentic but biased statement. And second, the information I just mentioned was first spread in China for stability maintenance purpose, but was later disseminated widely in Taiwan, while more than 600 similar posts were posted on Facebook in one day, actually in an hour. So at the very beginning, I asked myself, are they like just patriots from China? But it turns out they're not. They're YouTubers or live streamers that belong to the two companies that are actually owned by China. And that's also another way they could spread this information. So we got tons of examples here that we can try to categorize the most and see how we can counter this kind of disinformation. But I guess I'll leave the counterpart for the Q&A.
Thank you, Puma. Last but not least, turning the floor to Emerson.
Thank you, Jessica. So at the DFR lab, I've helped lead a team that's focused on 4 reports related to Chinese influence and disinformation, focused generally on the evolution of Chinese information operations, on diaspora targeted operations, and on events in Hong Kong and Taiwan. And I want to particularly thank Alicia Fawcett and Ian Robertson for really putting these reports together. So in general, it's important to take a step back and understand that China followed the weaponization of social media platforms really from the beginning. You can find Chinese military journals that attest and study, say, the Green Movement in Iran in 2009, and consider it essentially an information attack by the West. And you see continuing great interest, for instance, in the Arab Spring and the use of social media platforms in those protests. And then as they spread into Russia in the end of 2011. But actual Chinese investment in these capabilities for purposes of foreign targeting is relatively new. This sort of muscular foreign information operations is a recent development, and it's kind of an analog to a shift toward more aggressive Chinese foreign policy writ large. And this is the phenomenon we broadly describe as discourse power. Discourse power consists of overt methods. We've seen a sharp increase in the number of English-speaking official Chinese Communist Party accounts, and we also have seen a sharp increase in the pointed rhetoric that these accounts utilize when they're criticizing the governments of other countries. We've also seen, especially concurrent with the COVID-19 pandemic and crisis in the West and in the United States, starting in February, we saw a sharp increase in the output of English language Chinese state media entities like Xinhua, which are making a play, it seems, for a more international audience. And we've seen this evidence, this is broadly then described as sort of a mass diplomacy on the part of China, as the information conflict between China and the United States is really intensified. Along with these overt measures, though, related discourse power, we also see more covert developments. Last summer, for the first time, Twitter identified a network of accounts that was linked to the Chinese Communist Party, which had sought to manipulate conversation around Hong Kong. This was a network of about 1,000 accounts, but it was tied to a much larger spam network of about 200,000. And these accounts had also been spreading some conspiracy theories about the United States and its purported role in the Hong Kong protests. And then as we think about our individual reports, when we talk about the targeting of the Chinese diaspora, it's important to understand that the overseas self-identifying Chinese descendants, their number has doubled since 2000. It's now up to about 2.4 million in the United States. What's interesting is because Western platforms have always been banned in China proper, if you see significant Chinese language messaging, say on Facebook or Twitter, you can infer that these messages are intended to reach individuals in the Chinese diaspora. That's why you see fierce information conflicts, for instance, between pro-CCP entities on the one side and then entities connected with, say, Go Winggi on the other. Now, if we think about the case of Hong Kong, this is an example of pretty clever use by the Chinese with overt social discourse power. At the offset of the anti-extradition protests in early 2019, and then their intensification following police violence in Hong Kong, it very much seemed like the Chinese Communist Party was on the back foot. There was immense Western interest in these conflicts, and due in part to Hong Kong's longstanding position as an international commerce hub. But over time, Chinese messaging evolved, and there was a pointed effort to help heroize members of the Hong Kong police, and at the same time to kind of pull out of context and highlight instances of violence that were committed by the protesters. And over time, not only was this strategy effective, but it led to the broader denigration of pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong writ large, a development which may be fatal. It's interesting, though, that contrast this, as others on this panel have, with developments in Taiwan. We also were paying close attention to the 2020 presidential election. There is a general agreement that in the case of Taiwan in the 2018 regional elections, that China did engage in a lot of clandestine social media manipulation. Insofar as we could tell, that same volume of activity was not present in 2020, due in part to, we think, increased vigilance in Taiwanese society, due perhaps to the fact that as a younger population, there's quite a bit more savviness when it comes to digital manipulation methods. But in its place, we identify cases where Taiwanese citizens expressing pro-China views were nonetheless accused of somehow being agents of the mainland. And we just identify that as a potentially worrisome development. And we see analogs really, that sort of thing in Taiwan, we see it across the world, where as democracies have become more cognizant of foreign manipulation and interference, there is sometimes a tendency to accuse anyone with an inconvenient opinion as being an agent of a foreign power. So even as we guard against foreign interference, we must take great care not to go too far down that path. Thank you.
Thank you to all the panelists for your excellent remarks. I want to use the privilege of being moderator to ask the first question. This is perhaps coming from a slightly different angle, because I know most of the panelists talked about disinformation from pro-China forces. I want to ask about disinformation from anti-China forces. There's been a lot of talk and concern about the susceptibility of populations in Asian countries, notably Taiwan, Vietnam, as well as their respective diaspora communities in the United States, to disinformation about US elections, particularly on the outcome that it's rigged, and of Hunter Biden's supposed relationship with China. as disinformation researchers, I want to ask what your overall reactions are to these developments, and do you view this as a vulnerability that pro-China actors could exploit? Whoever wants to answer first, go ahead.
I'll speak quickly. Yeah, I think it is a vulnerability. I think it can be used both ways. And we've seen, as Emerson highlighted, a very powerful disinformation strategy emanating from Guo Wengui, or Miles Kwok, the exiled businessman from China who lives in the United States. It's been very effective, as you say, in pushing conspiracy theories about Hunter Biden and very critical of the CCP. At the same time, it has been a huge part of its message has been that the U.S. presidential election is reinforcing some of the things we've heard from some of our own actors, that the election somehow was stolen. And I think that that does play into the larger message that the Communist Party in China is trying to push, that somehow the U.S. system is fragile and that the Western democratic system has systematic flaws that make it not a good model. And by contrast, the Chinese model, as exemplified by the Communist Party in China, is a much more stronger, more robust model. I think also we've seen some of that with the misinformation about COVID as well, which the Chinese government has seized upon.
Do any of the other panelists have thoughts? If not, we'll move on to questions from the audience.
Well, I love that question, and I would just add there were a number of takedowns in the 2 years before between 2018 and 2020, before the U.S. 2020 election. A number of takedowns of networks that were targeting Americans using inauthentic coordinated behavior. The largest, probably, and the most impactful network by far was a series of accounts that were operated by the Epoch Times. So that is a real consideration. And in fact, it was, in general, when Facebook has been doing these sorts of activities, it is focused on state actors. It was unusual to have it be a non-state group. And we've seen more recently, as Jessica alluded to, with the spread of hacked materials from Hunter Biden, the spread of these materials appears to have been laundered through a Chinese Communist Party opposition front group, which was set up in collaboration with Steve Bannon, a former White House chief of staff in the United States. So there are all sorts of interesting intersections here. And I do worry about these sorts of entities as potential kind of entry points for disinformation. And in general, I would characterize, when there's a general consensus in the United States about a foreign actor, when we talk about China as an adversary, we talk about Iran and Russia as adversaries, it often creates an opening for opposition groups, which are quite extreme in their own rights, to push propaganda and really manipulate and exploit foreign audiences in ways that otherwise wouldn't be possible.
All right. I didn't know if Puma had any thoughts. I don't mean to put him on the spot, but just what I've been seeing in Taiwanese news has been, that Biden will be weak on Taiwan. And I wonder if that disinformation will affect continuity in U.S.-Taiwan relations and put overall U.S.-Taiwan relations at a much weaker spot. So I wonder if you or Amy had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, so speak on my experience here, because we have been infiltrating several chat groups there in China and see how their cyber force discuss the certain issues here right now here in Taiwan or in the US. And then I believe it's last month, there are lots of them pretend to be Taiwanese and try to support Trump, and then disseminated all these fake news or talking about how this election has been a whole fraud, things like that, and spread into the Taiwanese group. But it has been a failure on their side. So actually they decided to stop that last week and want to change the topic. And so that also answers to another question I think one of the audience here posted, is that it's very different from Russia, because there are so many departments over there in China, and some of them even support some even support Biden, because support Trump, because they hate Xi Jinping a lot. And all those departments, they kind of compete with each other and fight for the budget. So actually their cyber force will fight against each other actually in China. And sometimes they collaborate actually with Falun Gong or with the Advocate Times and just want to discredit another group of cyber force over there. So that's why it's really difficult to apply a Russian model on the Chinese case, because it has been very decentralized. And I think that's one of the perspectives I got to analyze all this Chinese disinformation online.
Thank you. Amy, do you have any thoughts, or should we move on to questions from the audience?
Sure. I mean, just a couple of thoughts on that. First of all, everything Puma said is spot on. I think one of the things that we see on Chinese disinformation is it's not necessarily always the Chinese government. Sometimes it's Chinese nationalist netizens. Sometimes it's business interests. One of the things that we are suspicious might be happening in Myanmar now is that Chinese provinces are starting to get involved in the disinformation game around territorial disputes. So there's really this whole multiplicity of interests and actors that are operating in the Chinese disinformation space, who aren't necessarily all on the same side as Xi Jinping, or might have different interests that are competing interests. So that's certainly been the case. The one thing that I will say is, I think one of the things that we're starting to see much more of, and this has been true with COVID in particular, is the manipulation of domestic information environments and of populations in the information ecosystem in an effort to impact transnational discussions about geopolitical threats. And so to your question, I think obviously there's a real focus on the US election given everything that's happened here, but we have been seeing this play out in literally every country of the world that IRI operates in, where transnational geopolitical issues are being fought out in the information space, in domestic information spaces as well.
Thank you. So our first question is from Ryan from CSET. He says that there's been recent reporting about the inadequacy of Chinese botnets on Twitter. Can the panelists speak to the balance of party resources dedicated to raising botnets as opposed to hiring internet commentators directly? Should Wu Mao expect layoffs in their future if the party continues to move toward automated astroturfing? Whoever has an answer, feel free to take the floor.
I can start. I think one of the things that we absolutely saw when we were looking at the Taiwanese case is that there were a lot of really stupid, dumb things that were done that would then be stopped. The most effective disinformation campaigns, and this is not to sort of advise those who want to be doing this, but some of the most effective disinformation campaigns do take advantage of domestic infrastructures that already exist, or international economically motivated infrastructures that already exist, rather than doing the Russian thing of trying to stand up the IRA, right? I think that what we saw in Taiwan was the use of the domestic astroturfing industry, the use of Malaysian content farms, as Puma was referencing, the sort of use of the international disinformation, commercially motivated infrastructure that exists. And so one of my concerns, although it feels like it will be something that is much easier to regulate, is the shift away from information operations as instruments of governments to using the existing infrastructure that a foreign malign authoritarian actor might use, a political party might use, a hate group might use. The infrastructure just exists.
So, and I'll add to that, and Ryan, it's great to hear from you that, look, the botnet that was uncovered last year was novel because it was the first time China had been so implicated in these sorts of foreign-facing activities. But the output and makeup of the botnet was extremely primitive, and it doesn't seem like the content was particularly persuasive. It was spam stuff. It was the kind of stuff you saw out of the Iranians maybe in 2014. But also in the case of China, I really don't think it matters because you have years of experience by using actual human beings to carefully cultivate opinion and expression online. And you have just economies of scale that aren't available to other disinformation actors. I think just Xinhua alone is up to maybe 80 million followers on Facebook, which is far more than any US media entity. There's so many other opportunities for China to exert influence that this like Twitter botnet stuff is really a trivial piece of that puzzle. I think if push came to shove, if you're thinking about an entity where we're most likely to see like, GPT-3 chatbots employed and Western platforms completely overrun, China would be the actor to do it. But it just doesn't seem like a priority now because there are so many other tools available. But a great question.
Thank you. All right, let's move on to other questions from the audience. We have one from Russell Shao from the Global Taiwan Institute, who wants to know about the functions and roles of the CCP's propaganda department and its United Front Work Department in disseminating propaganda and disinformation. Specifically, what organizations in the CCP system has the central authority for engaging in propaganda and disinformation? I think this is probably Dexter.
Actually, I think I may hand this off to someone else, maybe my colleague Emerson. Obviously, the United Front Work Department in the party plays a very, very key role and an increasing role in this. I would highlight as well their key role in establishing relations and trying to influence outside actors, including the business community. China's been very effective in their strategy of getting the global business community to parrot or avoid any comments that China sees as unfriendly to China or in any way might undermine its perceived territorial integrity and its sovereignty. So we've seen very powerful or effective campaigns by China where they've punished or threatened to punish different industries. The airline industry is one that, for example, did something that seemed pretty innocuous, seemed to be somehow suggesting Taiwan was a country on their website, although that wasn't their intention. Much of that is carried out through the United Front Work Department. But I think maybe perhaps if Emerson has something to say more specifically on which agencies within the CCP and the United Front would be involved, I'd like to hand it to him or anyone else.
Well, thanks, Tiff. And Russell, this is a great question. First, I'd recommend you to our Discourse Power report and to writings of Nathan Bochet Mustafaga, a RAND analyst who's done extensive work on specifically this question. I would say generally, my background is in studying US defense institutions. And something that really struck me in our work here is that I was surprised there was no coordinating entity, as one might assume as an outsider, that there's a single person in the party making these decisions. It did seem like, just as with the US, there are overlapping bureaucracies with different priorities. In general, there have been two important shifts here. The United Front, which is focused more on like civil persuasion, has begun to shift more toward express foreign interference operations. And then the writings and thinking within the PLA has begun to focus too much more expressly on foreign influence and foreign interference. I think really what stood out to me most in our studies was the extent to which the PLA was talking about the use of basically public social media assets in a way that our own US State Department might. That in the Chinese conception, that there was less of a clear line between these sorts of digital diplomacy tools, as we might characterize them, and assets that were adjacent to Chinese military objectives.
I'll just add one quick point on this. Attribution in digital forensics is really, really hard. When we went through in our report and attempted as far as we could to find the little breadcrumbs that brought us back to mainland China, we're still not attributing to the PLA. We're not attributing to Beijing. We're not able to attribute in such a precise way. So yes, absolutely, there's a lot of really great work out there that looks at the functioning of the Chinese Communist Party and the government government and sort of says, here is notionally what each thing is supposed to do. But when you look at the online information environment, you can't trace a particular narrative or network of actors very often back to a country or in particular to a single unit within a country. So at least in that space, it's really hard to say most of this is coming from X, right? What we can say is we see characteristics that this content was created by people with links to mainland China because of linguistic issues, or we look at the commercial or strategic interests and you say, this seems to align with the strategic interests of this actor that is a mainland Chinese actor, rather than being able to say, here's the department, here's their address, this is what they're doing.
Thank you. So we have 10 minutes left. So I want to group some of the questions together. We're getting a few about COVID-19. So the audience was wondering if you've seen anything on Chinese COVID-19 vaccine diplomacy, particularly as it pertains to disinformation or misinformation. And then there's a question on with the pandemic outbreak, Asian Americans or Asians in general have been the target of xenophobic attacks, both offline and online. And have we seen China take advantage in these narratives and propaganda? Thank you.
I might make a quick comment, Jessica. I would just say that in the case of COVID, unfortunately, the use of disinformation by China has not actually always been necessary. Just putting the information out and showing how in China's second act, it has done a very good job of controlling the pandemic, and contrasting it with the unfolding disaster, I might characterize it as, in our country, in the United States and other countries around the world, is effective in its own self. And this is certainly on the propaganda side, this has been seized upon, as one would expect, by the Chinese authorities, and they've run with it. And there is a message going around that says, look, we have, our system has been far, far better in controlling this pandemic. So I just make that comment. It's one of those cases where I would say we need to, in order to combat disinformation or just propaganda or information, the reality, we need to get our own house in order and start to deal more effectively with the challenge we face.
Anyone else, or should we move on to the next question?
Yeah, I'm not like a policy person, but I want to just briefly answer the previous questions over here. The role of the CCP, propaganda department, is kind of different from the United Front work. So the propaganda department has its own Twitter network, and they seldom work on Facebook or even on Weibo or WeChat. And they have different agenda from United Front Work Department. And actually, United Front Department does not have any cyber force. So the way, if they want to really have some impacts on the internet, they will pay some marketing companies to do that. And that's one of the strategies. So for example, if you look at the top 10 YouTubers that got donations online in Taiwan, actually the top 10 of them, there are 7 of them actually are YouTubers that support Han Guoyu. And the way they got donation is that because you don't really need to ask them to distribute certain disinformation. You just have people actually view their YouTube channel, and actually they can bring them the volume and bring them the money. And that's the way they could influence this and provide the financial interest or this kind of benefits, and people will join the market and then simultaneously or voluntarily to distribute certain kinds of disinformation that is for China. That's very sophisticated, but it's a very different way because United Front War Department does not have its own cyber force.
All right. We're also getting a number of questions on the Chinese narrative that the American system is failing. And the audience wants to know if that narrative is aimed primarily at Chinese domestic audiences or if it has broader outreach goals.
2 points on that. One, I'm certain that there is certainly a defense of the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese system framework behind that as well that is primarily aimed at domestic audiences. We also see it playing out in geopolitical frameworks as well. As I mentioned earlier, Chinese aid diplomacy, all of the misinformation that has been spread by officials and amplified by the broader network of Chinese influence around what Chinese aid and the response to the virus has looked like is literally present everywhere. It's not just here in the US, it's not just in China domestically, it's not just the expat population, it's being the Chinese diaspora population, it's being published in Spanish and French and all kinds of different languages, literally all over the world. And so there's also a geopolitical goal there, which is to strengthen China and the role of the Chinese Communist Party here as well. I want to say one quick thing on how we respond to that, right? And this is really where I think Taiwan gave us the strongest lesson. There's one version of the response which says we need to get rid of all of the accounts. We need to take down all of the misinformation. We need to, in some instances, what we're seeing is social media shutdowns, internet shutdowns. There's absolutely a response that says there's so much disinformation that we need to shut it down. The Taiwanese response was more democracy, more openness, more transparency, taking the lead from civil society, working with civil society to raise trust, to publish data, to respond quickly, to put the truth out there, rather than taking every single piece of disinformation and trying to deal with it, or every network of disinformation actors and trying to deal with that in and of itself. And I think that as we see these information operations proliferate from China, from other actors, domestic and malign foreign authoritarians, that kind of digital resiliency of governments and civil society is going to be the way that we deal with it and the way that democracy can win.
So in general, I think if you were to characterize, and this far predates the discourse power stuff we're talking about, if you were to broadly characterize a lot of Chinese public messaging, I think it's always emphasized on instances of perceived hypocrisy in the West, where the West might expect, one thing of China, but might be doing something different at home, at least in the Chinese arguments. And that's why we have terms like lawfare, in which we say that China is essentially trying to weaponize Western law to achieve Chinese objectives. But two recent examples that really are illustrate the sort of use of hypocrisy. I've been fascinated by Chinese state messaging around the George Floyd protests, where there was quite a bit of emphasis from what I could see in Chinese state media. But the purpose of that emphasis was not so much to point to the deterioration of the West, but more is a kind of way to signal that a lot of Western criticisms of Chinese actions in Hong Kong that maybe the West needed to mind its own business. That we had similar unrest and protests at home, and then in a similar vein, we've seen with the fallout of the US election and continuing allegations at home of unsubstantiated fraud, China selectively identifying and amplifying these narratives, really just to demonstrate that the US open, accountable system is maybe not as open and accountable as Americans say. But again, the purpose, I think, is not to destroy or denigrate Western institutions so much as it is to kind of blunt our ability to criticize Chinese actions.
All right, so we have a minute left. If Dexter or Puma have any closing remarks, if not, I will. Puma, go ahead.
Oh yeah, I just have a quick answer on that one. Is that as everyone knows here, it's like different newspaper stands for different departments there in China. So it really depends if that newspaper is very close to propaganda department, and if that is written in English or any foreign language, that could be for a foreign audience. And if we really want to look at the impacts on overseas Chinese, the best way to do that is to look at the WeChat public pages. That's the most sophisticated and most influential way for the Chinese government if we want to convey or deliver certain messages to overseas Chinese.
I would just say quickly that if what Amy characterized as Taiwan's approach, being more proactive, not just taking down the misinformation, disinformation, but actually countering it with real information, I think is key to going forward. And there's a lot of work there as well in the United States that we can do to ensure that we counter those messages with our own discourse, if you will.
With that, we're at time. So I'd like to thank all four of the panelists for their time and for their excellent remarks. Definitely a topic to keep watching into the future. Thank you everyone who showed up to listen, and I hope you all have a good afternoon.